So let's get to today's speakers. I want to introduce our guests. We are joined today by a couple of industry-leading subject matter experts on allyship. From Microsoft, we have Lindsay-Rae McIntyre, Chief Diversity Officer. Hello, Lindsay-Rae. There you are. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone.
Great to have you here. Next, I'd like to welcome our Diversity and Inclusion Practice Lead, Esther Neznanova, who will be on the chat, engaging your comments and questions. David will be bringing her on periodically. Hi, Esther.
Hi, Gabe. Happy to be here.
And we're also joined by our by our VP of Consulting Practices and Research, Mr. Khalil Smith. Khalil is having some technical difficulties on getting on. I know we'll be having him here shortly.
I
Khalil,
am here, Gabe. Hello.
Oh, you are here. Excellent.
Yes.
So glad. That was exciting before we launched. So glad you're here. And kicking us off is our CEO and co-founder, Dr. David Rock. David, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Gabe, for yet again your incredible work behind the scenes, pulling all this together. It's quite a project. We've been doing these since early March, since about the first or second week of March, with only one break for Juneteenth. Thanks for your efforts and work here. And so let's dig in. Big topic, allyship. Lindsay-Rae, I remember seeing you, I think maybe a year ago, maybe a little more in Redmond, and just kind of catching up with you. And you first brought this up to me. You were like, I want to work on allyship. And at the time I was like, what's that? I really didn't have an idea, and I was kind of curious. We're going to dig into that in a minute, but you've been there for a while, a couple of years now, I think, at Microsoft, but also across the space of D&I for quite some time. I mean, what's different about diversity and inclusion now? Kind of what do you feel is different in the space right now?
Yeah, thanks, David. And I remember that conversation so clearly. I would say that while there's a bunch that doesn't feel different about the diversity and inclusion space, the one thing that does feel different is the accountability, the self-reflection of the ally community in particular, right? That as a result of, COVID and, the fact that there was this sense that it was a shared experience, and yet we knew that it had a very different impact on marginalized communities in particular. And the acts of hate and violence against the Black and African American community, while not new, have caused many communities all over the world to deepen their empathy and understanding of what's going on, and perhaps what they were unwilling to be aware of or learn about in the past. And so the activation that is coming from the ally community in particular to just pause and learn and listen and be self-accountable feels different in these last months, for sure.
Really different. I guess that if I'm thinking about it sort of cognitively, like people's emotions were very raw already. And then they saw these disadvantaged communities being disadvantaged massively more, to the point of literally, increased mortality. And that, on top of the emotional rawness is really big. And then the violence on top of that kind of looped back to everything else. It's like, whoa, I can't let this, continue. It's amazing to see just how much it's really activated people. But incredible times. Khalil, glad you could join us. There was some challenges there earlier. Thanks for being here. And I know you've been leading the charge on our work in this space as well. You were heading up our D&I practice. You now support Esther in that, but you're really across all of consulting and all the work we're doing with organizations. Thanks for leading the charge on the allyship work. Tell us, Lindsay-Rae, I mean, tell us a little bit about your allyship journey, I guess. Let's start with that. And, how did it start, and what's that been like?
Yeah, I would say that, I celebrated my 2-year anniversary with Microsoft yesterday. And when I arrived, I was struck by the momentum of Microsoft really focusing on growth mindset for the last 5 or so years. And allyship really puts growth mindset into action. And so, for us at Microsoft, allyship was an opportunity to give the entirety of the company, which is, more than 152,000 people who, are either in or do business with 190 countries, the opportunity to have shared language and shared understanding about this phraseology called allyship. And so, it was the opportunity to be able to say everybody could have an ally, everybody could be an ally, but it came with the core understanding that regardless, anyone who wanted to aspire to be an ally really had to be willing to engage with empathy and care in service of supporting somebody else in the way that they wanted to be supported. And that was a bit of a shift, but also allowed us to take advantage of some of the good work that we've done with you around transitioning into habit formation and daily practice.
Oh, David, you're on mute.
I know we've been working on allyship and like really kind of scrambling in a way to take it to a whole next level in the last few months, but actually we've been working on it in the background with you guys for over a year.
Yeah.
It's gone out really widely, the frameworks that we built together. I'm curious, and Khalil, I'd love to hear from you. I know that I think you're with us now fully. Are you able to speak up?
Yep.
Oh, fantastic. I wasn't sure if
you can keep me from speaking up, David.
please feel free. I know you've got a really nice definition, Lindsay-Rae. I'd love to hear the definition you guys have of allyship.
Yeah, at Microsoft, allyship is the intentional decision to engage with empathy and care in service of supporting somebody else in the way that they want to be supported.
Lindsay, I'm curious. I know, one of the tensions I think that has come up is about are allies a particular group? Are they a particular demographic? And the way that you described it is anyone can have an ally, anyone can be an ally. And as you all kind of thought about that, rolled it out, kind of had that conversation, any advice for others that would be rolling it out? Any thoughts or reflections?
I think it's important to understand sort of the outcome that we're trying to drive for our organization. So at Microsoft, we are hugely global. And while the phraseology of allyship doesn't always perfectly translate around the world, the behavior does, right? And so for us, it was really about taking allyship from something that was potentially, done as an act on behalf of somebody else to a co-creation and a behavior, right? So it went from being sort of, in the broader space, it's not a badge for Microsoft, it is a behavior. And it's not sort of a heroic cape, it's a commitment. And so there's a ongoing journey that comes with being an ally. It's not something that's one and done and you get to be like, yay, I'm an ally. No, that doesn't happen, right? We have to continue to understand that, our aspirations as allies are really to be helpful in ways that other people want us to be helpful. And we say sort of two things naturally happen intuitively in the allyship space. You either watch something go down and you go like, whew, I am so glad that didn't happen to me. And we'll get to sort of your speaking up stuff in a minute, but or you jump in super enthusiastic to make a difference without actually knowing enough and can actually leave, a conversation or an experience having done harm as a very well-intended ally. And so I think, the need for us in the ally community to, and everybody who aspires to be an ally, really just coming and getting connected to, at least for Microsoft, we put allyship as a growth mindset in action because it is a muscle we have to work on in every meeting, in every interaction, in every sort of day that we work. And we're going to fail, by the way, right? Super uncomfortable. We're going to get it wrong.
Right.
And the neuro threat of oh my goodness, I got that wrong and now I don't want to do it again and that really hurt. And no, it's the least we can do in service of wanting to invest in one another's success in the workplace.
Yeah. So Lindsay-Rae, could you speak to a little bit about how that has evolved? Because David spoke about kind of our point of view has continued to evolve, and we were fortunate enough to work with you early. And I know you all have kind of started in potentially one place, and as you talk about it, like people maybe have learned a bit more and stepped into it a bit. I'm just curious, kind of walk us through a bit of your journey from maybe where it started and anything that you feel like materially has changed as you all have defined and thought about and taught the skills of allyship and the habits.
Yeah, I would say that, it is evolved for us. We built off of the great work that we did with you all around SCARF and, helping people understand SCARF and how it plays a role, building off of Microsoft's momentum around growth mindset and really getting, allyship in the context of this is a muscle, right? That we're moving away from diversity and inclusion as just a compliance exercise, and really at Microsoft for some time have embraced that it is a cultural transformation accelerator that requires us individually to invest in our learning and our habit formation change. And so, I would say that when we started it, there is different levels of engagement, but when you have a workforce as big as Microsoft's, we want everybody to understand what allyship is at Microsoft, so that inside Microsoft, we understand what we can count on with one another. And so in the announcements that we've made recently, you've seen that we mandated or put into our required learning tracks the introduction to allyship. We're not suggesting that everybody needs to choose to be an ally. That for sure is a personal choice. And for the individuals who choose to do that, we have deep, robust allyship learning journeys and skills-based journeys for them. But we do think that it is minimally important for everybody at Microsoft to just have an understanding of the language that we use, the behaviors that go with it, and what we can count on from and with one another as we go on our allyship journey together.
Love that.
I've thrown up on screen our working definition of allyship, and I say working definition because we're still working on it.
Exactly.
Literally. And I actually really like yours, Lindsay-Rae, the definition you had. A number of people have been asking for it. Can you repeat the definition Microsoft uses for allyship?
Yeah, and I'm happy to sort of put it in the chat, and what we sort of put up in the systems and what comes sort of off my tongue may not be, perfectly aligned, but it is, an ally at Microsoft who is somebody who intentionally engages with empathy and care to support someone else in the way in which they would want to be supported.
Yeah. And David, I think to your point, the reason it's a working definition, and Lindsay-Rae, I love that as well, is because there are all these different nuances, I think, associated with it. And you all, Lindsay-Rae, have traditionally been a bit further ahead in terms of your maturity for your diversity and inclusion work. And as you've said, and I might invite Esther in here as well, because you've spoken with a lot of chief diversity officers recently. But this idea that it is about accepting that there are differences in power dynamics, and then, to your point, Lindsay-Rae, it's being active, right? Allyship is not passive. It's not I've just, I went through this course, now I'm an ally. It absolutely is something that is critical and active and habitual, which is why we talk so much about the habits. But really for us, in terms of trying to get the definition right and the language right, is this constant mix of awareness and action, that I understand the impact that I can have and that I'm intentional about where I direct that impact.
Yeah, and it is completely inclusive, right? So the idea that anybody could be an ally,
yes,
benefit from an ally is really important, because as you all know well, when you get to privilege and power, it can be situational and it can be circumstantial. And so, we don't subscribe to the idea that, allyship can only be done by some or only can be of the benefit to some. Right? That this is when we do it well, it is a behavior that we all can leverage and engage with as we invest in one another's success in the workplace.
Yeah. Esther, I'm curious to hear kind of what you're hearing as well, because I know you and I have had a number of conversations around allyship and the working definition and some of the massaging we've continued to do there, but also like, you know, the maturity of organizations as it relates to where Lindsay-Rae and Microsoft are, as opposed to where some others are thinking about allyship fitting in.
Yes, I think the biggest difference here is that a lot of companies that are in the beginning stages of working in allyship, they actually often misplace it together with employee resource groups. And they launch programs that define specific people as allies. And I loved your quote, Lindsay-Rae, I wrote it down, it's not a badge, it's a behavior. And in the beginning stages, what we're seeing is that companies literally often give out the badges and the stickers saying you're an ally. And that goes back to once an ally, always an ally is a myth, because it has to exist within the culture. It has to exist within the framework of speaking up. And it's really about a behavior and an embedded culture of the whole company.
Yeah. I mean, David put this up, so I'd love for you maybe to speak to it a little bit, Esther, and then Lindsay-Rae, I'd kind of forecast that I would love to understand either A, did any of these myths really jump out at you all as you got things started? Or are there any that maybe were really relevant to you that we don't have described here? But Esther, I know you just put out an article that actually highlighted these 3 myths and talked about them a little bit. So if you could maybe just give a little bit of color around like why these are myths, and then Lindsay-Rae, anything that we might have missed that we should write about next.
Yes, thank you, Khalil. So the first one is around awareness is not enough. So it is twofold, really. The first one is that just knowing what an ally is doesn't automatically make you an ally. And speaking up on behalf of others without asking them or deeply listening or really understanding how they want for you to speak up on their behalf is not really allyship. Then we're moving into allyship equals friendship. So if I have friends that are people of color, that doesn't mean I'm an ally. It just means that I have my friend circles. What makes me an ally is proactively being an advocate for those that are at a disadvantage in the moment, as well as part of my values. And the last one here is around once an ally, always an ally. And Lindsay-Rae touched on that. It is the actions in the moment that make a difference. It is your behavior and really standing up for others and advocating for others when you're seeing something happening. So if you know about allyship and if you know how to be an ally and you spoke up for somebody once, it doesn't mean that you have that badge of honor of being an ally, but rather it's that repeated action of really with empathy and with deep understanding around people's experiences, being able to speak up for them in situations.
Awesome, that's helpful.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add there is that, you know, at Microsoft, we really, we also partnered with Kenji Yoshino from the NYU Center of Belonging and Inclusion, and, you know, really unpacked the idea that for any of us at any point in time, we could be working on, you know, our learning journey and our allyship muscle as it relates to being an ally for one, an ally for some, or an ally for all. And those are different opportunities for us to engage, you know, at very different levels that have different impact. We also talk about Microsoft's empathy triangle that has sort of the players in a given scenario. And, you know, I think it's so important, at least for us at Microsoft, that we don't shame the source of the non-inclusive behavior, right? That doesn't stitch to growth mindset for us. And so, you know, leveraging the momentum of growth mindset, we really, you know, use our allyship framework and language so that we can learn from one another, even in those moments where it feels uncomfortable. Because as I said before, like, we are absolutely going to get it wrong. And so, you know, it's important for us at Microsoft that, you know, we aren't in the business of speaking up for others, right? That we do the work to connect and be personalized in how we can be helpful, knowing how it is other people would want for us to help. And that takes work, right? That takes more than sort of good intention.
Right.
That requires a curiosity and a sort of an investment that is next level.
Now, Lindsay-Rae, I know if it's not already in the chat that people are going to want a deeper dive into allyship for one, allyship for some, and allyship for all. Again, I want to prime you that I'd love to come back to that, but Esther, it looked like you had a thought.
Oh yes, that was exactly it. I just wanted to flag that both in this chat and on LinkedIn Live chat. They're asking about specific examples of being an ally in a situation, because it did, the term initially was created through the support of our LGBTQI colleagues. So how did that evolve? And give us some examples of situations. And then exactly that, Khalil, if Lindsay-Rae can talk a little bit about that continuum.
Sure. So, again, I think, it's important for any of these terms to be used in the context of an individual organization and an individual organization's desire and impact. So please don't hear me saying that I think that, this is the perfect framework for everybody. And we don't pretend to have it all figured out either, right? That this is something that we continue to iterate and grow on. But it is because of sort of the unique circumstance of growth mindset and the momentum that particular skill set and mindset has inside Microsoft that allowed us to shape our allyship work. When we think about sort of ally to one, right? Like, let's say that, Esther is, somebody on my team, and I'm really committed to Esther, and I invest time in learning about Esther and how I can be helpful to Esther. Then in meetings with Esther or without Esther, I at least am connected and aware about how best to show up for and contribute, knowing what Esther would want. That's ally to one, right? But it's not super scalable, right? Because it's specific to Esther. Ally to some would be if you, in your journey are going deep on a community, knowing that no one community is a monolith and that there's nuance and complexity and texture within a community. Esther, your LGBTQI plus example even is, I would suggest that, being an ally for some would be for the lesbian community and the gay community, that LGBTQI plus is a huge landscape all by itself in a learning journey to be able to understand and respect how to be helpful for each of those communities. And then ally for all, you think about sort of systems changes that you can do to change how we think about in the workplace, how we look at data, how we influence promotion processes, how we influence manager training at scale, how we impact, broader society and behavior. That's, an ally to all kind of position. So there are tons of examples. Those are just a couple. And then the question on the empathy triangle is, the ally, the individual for whom is wanting an ally, and then, potentially the source of the non-inclusive behavior. And so, that becomes a conversation and a learning opportunity for all three in the empathy triangle.
Makes a ton of sense. And
sorry,
David,
we're going to a super brainy place, but I feel if I'm going to do it anywhere, we do it with NLI, right?
Exactly. That's what we do here on our Friday webinars, is brainy stuff.
Let's do it. Let's get a little brainy. It's a good segue to a piece I wanted to share briefly on just kind of the deeper science. So if I can just share for a couple of minutes. We've been thinking a lot about what gets in the way of being an ally, because it turns out the data, if you sort of poll people and say, do you feel like you're an ally? Like over 90% of people say yes. And then when you look at our people taking some kind of action, it's very, very low. So like what gets in the way between sort of people thinking they are and actually doing it? So there's a couple of domains to understand. We did some research a couple of years back that's incredibly relevant to this, which is on the cognitive effects of power. And it turns out that even a little bit of power, like you're sort of with a group of peers and then someone says, all right, you're leading us. Even that little bit of power has a very surprisingly large effect cognitively on your brain. And we pulled this apart and we've done a lot of research on this, but there are three main things. you basically start objectifying people not in the sexual sense, but in the sense of you turn people into concepts or objects in your brain. And you do that sort of so that you can move them around and think more conceptually rather than think of them as people, because that has some sort of efficiencies with working memory and people. But to cut a long story short, you become much more goal focused and sort of conceptual, much less people focused. So you're not, when you think about a person, you're not thinking about their goals and their intentions, their motives, right? Why they're doing what they're doing. You're just thinking of them as a concept, kind of packaged up. And so that happens just even with a little bit of power. It's kind of the opposite of empathy. You're sort of pulling the empathy out, right? When you get a little bit of power. And so you got to kind of fight that, or, work against that natural tendency. And the second one is you have a tendency with a little bit of power to very much focus on the positive and be overly optimistic and not sensitive to the downside of things that you could be doing. And then the third one actually is interesting, is that you become much higher construal. In other words, you're thinking in more abstract terms in terms of kind of chunks and groups and concepts more so than details. So you're forest, not trees. Now, it turns out all of these three things have really helpful adaptive value when leading people, right? Because actually you need to be very goal focused, not just care about everyone. You need to be overly optimistic at times to do hard things, and you need to actually think conceptually. So they have a value, but also a dark side. And particularly when it comes to this conversation, I think it can be easy for these things to kind of fall away. So we go a little deeper into the science of this when we're teaching this, but it's really helpful to understand this kind of this frame of what can happen. It's kind of not your fault. If you've got some power, this stuff's just going to happen, whether you're a good person or not. It's just something that happens in the brain. So you've got to put in processes to kind of deal with that. The other thing is a lot of research on perceived fairness and advantaged inequality. Some big research domains on the way people perceive things are fair even when they're not, and in particular if they're advantaged, they'll see things in very, very different ways. So there's a whole body of research in that. And then finally, there's the big area that we think is critical here, which is speaking up. And it's essentially the big challenges are actually challenges to speaking up. Like being able to actually notice when you should say something, being able to manage your emotion, and then also being able to speak up in a way that's productive for others. So those are sort of some of the things that get in the way, and then also the things to actually work on. I'll just go back to that one. So these are kind of the three big challenges: is power, the way we perceive the situation, and then just it's actually difficult speaking up, and people need to build those habits. Lindsay-Rae, do you want to speak to anything there, or anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think that it's awesome when you sort of take us to the brain and the science. So I see a bunch of people in the chat super excited about what you just went through, as am I. I think that we have to also understand that privilege is power, and that if we subscribe to the idea that for any one of us, we could have privilege in a moment or in a circumstance, and that gives us the opportunity to engage in a way that would benefit others, right? And so we're coming from a place of you either are or you aren't, right? As opposed to really understanding that even if I didn't grow up with socioeconomic privilege, I am still white, and that comes with privilege, right? Or I am able-bodied, or right? And so I am straight, I am right. There are any number of circumstances where, depending on the scenario, any one of us could potentially have privilege and therefore power that could be used for good. And I see a bunch of people sort of talking about downside and upside. We just have to be sophisticated enough now to know that all of those things are in play, even in the moment, right? And that there are times where we're going to have enough information and enough skill and have invested enough in our education to speak up and to do so responsibly and thoughtfully. And there are other places where we're not going to know enough, and we're actually going to have to go off and do our homework and do better the next time.
Yeah, no, a few people are asking, and I think this is pertinent to like talk more about speaking up. I'll go back to that slide. We launched a solution about a year ago called Voice.
Yeah, we love it.
Yeah, it addresses the critical habits that actually just get people to speak up more, and it comes from the insight that people just don't speak up anywhere near as much as they should. And there's a continuum. There's kind of sharing your ideas, there's challenging other people's ideas, and then there's challenging behaviors. And that top one is the hardest one, challenging behaviors. And most habits or strategies kind of start right there, but we think you've got to start at the beginning. Just get people into the practice of just sharing their ideas and challenging each other, so that that's actually comfortable, something they do. And then when it comes to, like, supporting an ally, challenging someone else around allyship, doing that harder stuff, they're more likely to speak up. I'll put those habits back up, but do you want to speak to that? And maybe Khalil, you have some comments as well, just on, we think learning to speak up is the thing to work on. That's kind of the muscle to really work on around allyship. Can you speak to that?
I think that, a lot of that, at least inside Microsoft, it really helps that we have senior leaders who are willing to role model what it looks like to engage in those conversations, to listen to the hard messages, to use the language from the voice training and our allyships, stuff, to say, what, I might get this wrong, but I'm really committed and invested. And so I'm going to say what I want to say. And then I really invite you to coach me, teach me, engage with me, but I'm going to give it a shot because it matters to me to get better. And so, senior leaders role modeling it, but then also sort of taking it out of something that we sort of save for a special moment, but just use it a little bit every day, right? Try, learn, noticing in the moments where you don't speak up. At least for me, I finish each day going like, where did I get it right? And where do I need to do better tomorrow, right? To the good work that you all give us on habit formation, right? Like I give myself a little bit of a scorecard every day on sort of the decide, include, and voice modules so that, I can continue to keep it on the front burner. And I know that at least in Microsoft, that's so much of the habit formation work that we're doing at scale.
Yeah, I'll come back to that in a minute, those three modules, because we do have a point of view on kind of the way to do this right, and kind of how to do this, really, really right. But Khalil, you have an awesome piece of language that you started sharing recently, I love, around kind of speaking up when you're not sure how. Can you dig into that a little bit?
I thought your head might be going there. Yeah, Lindsay-Rae, I love that idea of, trying things out and being honest and being vulnerable and integrating some grace in. And so I've taken to calling them clumsy conversations, just recognizing that they're not going to be fluid all the time. And that if I can say, hey, Lindsay-Rae, I'm trying out this new language. I don't know if I've quite got it right, but, and then you're saying, well, oh, that's interesting, right? It lowers the overall threat. It increases some of the relatedness. And David, I know you had some of the slides up about SCARF before, and that is absolutely kind of a central theme for how we continue to connect with one another. But we've found that language of clumsy conversations has just been helpful for some because it's not about being super fluent in these things all the time. And to your point, Lindsay-Rae, like if we only break it out once we feel like we've really understood it, and yet we never break it out enough to actually practice and kind of stumble over it a little bit, but know that I'm not going to be judged and know that I'm not all of a sudden going to be, kind of talked about to other people, but truly we're going through it together. And I think that's one of the things that's so powerful about you all rolling this out to your leadership team. And then to your point, making the commitment to say, our entire population is going to go through the kind of beginning layers of this so that we're all stumbling through that language together. And if you get it slightly wrong, so what? So did I, right? And that you have that frame to say at the end of the day, how often did I try to get it right? How often did I really lean in? So the clumsy conversations, I'm personally embracing them. I think because I have a lot of clumsy conversations, I'm just looking for some cover for myself maybe, but it works.
I think we're at like 1 or 2 a week between us, Khalil. I'm pretty sure.
At least.
It's quite funny. We label it. This is the continuum I was mentioning. And we had an insight maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago when we were working on this whole voice thing of like, this same problem is basically showing up in all these different places. So, just getting people to share their ideas for innovation and getting people to mitigate bias, getting people to challenge each other's ideas. And what we saw is that most attempts at, for example, addressing not just allyship, but also addressing, sexual harassment, unethical issues, all that. Most attempts anchor on the top right, they anchor on just go after the really challenging behaviors and actually disempower people from speaking up about the gray areas, the things that happen sort of all the time, and end up anchoring people too much on, the really big issues. In fact, what we should do, we believe what we should do is be increasing people's weekly speaking up practices. So it's literally each week you should be noticing yourself more intentionally, either sharing an idea or challenging an idea or challenging a behavior. But the science part of that is you've got to really manage your anxiety when you do that. And this is the strange part, actually manage the recipient's reaction as well. It's almost like you've got to help de-escalate if you're going to escalate. And in you kind of doing what you can, it's not your responsibility, but you can do things, in you doing what you can to help de-escalate someone else's reaction when you challenge them or their decision, right? You actually are much more effective in creating change versus just creating a reaction. So that's kind of the way we've been thinking about this whole thing is how do you, you're not in charge of someone's reaction, but how can you speak up in a way that the other person really gets on board because they're not fighting you off and fending you off. And a lot of that's been about scarf. Anyway, that's some of the science.
David, the only thing I would add there is, even as we sort of go on the learning journey of developing our speaking up skill sets and mindsets, it is often the case that we intuitively go to speaking up about someone other than ourselves. Oh, I saw that Khalil was trying to say something in a meeting, or I saw that Esther, had an experience that I want to speak to. I just want to help us sort of get connected to the fact that even that is distancing sort of the fear and accountability. The place that we have to start is with self, right? What I have noticed, what I am experiencing, right? And so, starting with self is the hardest thing to do. Even as I've sort of watched the sort of the response over the last several months, people want to jump to action because they want to do something, and yet it's important to just sort of be still and invest in your learning. There's so much we don't know, and so I think that we just have to recognize that sort of as humans, the hardest place to start is with self. And yet that's exactly the place where we have to start.
Lindsay, I'm going to jump in while there's a little bit of a lull, because I do have a question around for you all. How has allyship fit into your overarching diversity and inclusion strategy? And then David, again, would love to come to you after that, because I know you were talking about one of the slides that you have that kind of shows the way that we've been thinking about it. But we'd just love to understand, Lindsay-Rae, how does it fit together in the totality of the kind of ecosystem that you all have built over years?
Yeah, for us, it's sort of it's a bit of an umbrella set of ideas. Again, partnering with Kenji Yoshino, we introduced covering, so people had an idea of what covering was and how it showed up. And then allyship is again sort of a broader framework to understand sort of how to put growth mindset in action and how to get at habit formation change with some specificity in service of an outcome, which is that we will, create the space for everybody in the context of Microsoft's values to bring everything that they have into developing, amazing products, services, customer experiences. And so, that's really sort of, it's not a sort of a standalone thing that we sort of set off to the side. It's really a broader piece of the strategic umbrella where power will fit in, where privilege will fit in, where other conversations on identity, geography, and community will stitch in, because we really do sort of think that, you know, the behaviors and the habits that come from the allyship investment ladder across the totality of the diversity and inclusion conversation.
That's great. Thank you. David, what about you? How are we thinking about this?
Yeah, no, we you know, as anytime we're tackling a domain, we are thinking in three categories. We're thinking about how do we make this important to people so they care, make it a priority. What are the essential habits, like the fewest possible habits that have the biggest possible return, that fit together well, that you can learn one at a time and that will then stick. And this is for all our work, but in particular in this space, it's a challenging space. You want to give people just a few things to do that really, really work. And then what are the systems that support that? Now, the challenge with this space is also, it kind of rests on, you know, like a lot of other things, like a willingness to be wrong, a willingness to recognize bias, a willingness to like actively include. So we do think that allyship is not something you just, you know, teach maybe as a couple of habits on its own. It does live within the broader set of habits people need to be, you know, inclusive leaders overall. But this is something that Esther was working on in terms of the sort of how to think about allyship. Do you want to talk about this briefly, Esther?
Yes, happy to. So the first part that Lindsay-Rae mentioned is around defining allyship for leaders and weaving it into the culture as, what you said, Lindsay-Rae, an umbrella. And we need to build a commitment to a culture of speaking up within the organization, because allyship is tied to speaking up. And as we talked about here, it's important to learn to speak up for yourself before you speak up for others. We also identified that it is very important to give the leaders, the senior leadership team, the tools to actually build the culture of speaking up through executive briefings, and then diving into habit formation and the training. And I would love to hear more about your experience with training on speaking up, Lindsay-Rae. And then when it comes to the systems, it's around really weaving it into your talent management systems and creating specific guidelines for the whole organization to be able to instill the culture of speaking up and allyship.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Esther. There's this really interesting tension going on at the moment between kind of doing things right and doing things right now. Doing things right versus doing things right now. This is interesting tension where there is a strong sense of priority right now, which is wonderful, amazing, awesome, you know, fantastic. And so there's this, you know, a lot of CEOs saying we want to do something really big right now. And you know, there's a little danger in that. And I'll just, you know, give you a pause and say, don't do a mandated training, like a compulsory training, bad idea. Really difficult. Now, something you're committed to every employee going through, but, you know, in many different forms, you know, over time as part of other things, fantastic. You know, you're trying to get it out to every team member. That's different to, you know, everyone has to go through this training this month in this way. The research is that backfires. So, you know, we've been thinking about the right way to do this. And certainly there are really three kind of sets of habits that this lives on. And Lindsay-Rae was mentioning include, decide, and voice, which are our three solutions. And Microsoft, like a number of firms, have licensed our work to use it all sorts of creative ways, you know, and really put the work everywhere, which has been wonderful to see. But include is it's really about weekly, and I said essential weekly habits because these are things literally people should see themselves doing every week, like at least 1 to 3 times. You know, actively including is something people should be doing, and folks should notice them doing that. Folks should notice their leader doing that. Intentionally mitigating bias. And we have data on this that, you know, if you have 10,000 employees, you should have about 500,000 acts of bias mitigation a year. I'll say that again. If you have 10,000 employees, you should have about 500,000 acts of bias mitigation that really clearly are bias mitigation. That's how you address the systems and the systemic challenges that are in there. And then the third one is the one we've been focusing on here, which is speaking up effectively for yourself and others, is really learning to do that across that continuum. And I will say we're just in the kind of beta stages of building kind of a 3-module program that just anchors on speaking up effectively. So if people are wanting to do something big, they're wanting to do it, we are building something that will build habits one at a time over a month that you can scale. So, reach out to us if you're interested in that. But the right way, as opposed to right now, the right way we believe is to actually spend, a month teaching a whole company of any size how to include, a month teaching a whole company to how to mitigate bias, a month teaching a whole company how to then speak up, kind of in this order. Doing that over maybe 6 months, maybe 12 months, kind of staggered over. And it's any size organization. That's the way that we think about this.
And David, I would say, to sort of, the way that it's worked for us at Microsoft is really, embedding and weaving these concepts into, all of the work that we are doing. And so again, it's not a one and done sort of standalone isolated training. We weave it throughout so we can generate coherence and skill set and keep, letting people see it, feel it, practice it, work through it, through manager training, employee training, onboarding, total rewards training, when we did, our deep dives on inclusion in COVID, it's about sort of creating the ongoing availability of the reinforcing concepts that allow us to actually keep it front of mind and generate the habit. And I loved what you said about sort of, while there is urgency in the system, perhaps the most compelling and important thing that any of us can do in our organizations is to understand that, we are only ever as good as our ability to sustain this conversation and to keep the intensity up. And that is for the ally community in particular, right? That we have to, as allies, know that there is no going back.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That if we're brand new to this conversation, listen hard and learn hard. If you are an aspiring ally or think you're an ally, figure out how we up our game in a totally different way. And for people who have no idea why we're talking about this at all, I think it's important just to get curious and understand the opportunity for broad impact.
I've been thinking about that, and a few people asked me recently, like, if we want to do this right, but we also want to do this right now, like if we want to show real commitment, what should we do? And I said, and what came to me is, your decision on kind of a strategy to address this stuff is really important. You should think of it as more important than installing a software system, right? Much more important. So you should do your due diligence. And the way you do your due diligence is, unless, I don't want to say, but you've got to follow the science. Like, follow the science. We've seen the advantages of following the science and not following the science in our society, right now. So in this space, follow the science. If you want to do this seriously, then, get your senior leaders to agree to, getting a research briefing from multiple organizations, probably 2 or 3, on the science of actually addressing this space. We obviously have a strong research briefing on, how to really create change properly at the level of habits in organizations. But get a briefing from us, get a briefing from others, get your whole leadership team to agree to, 3 90-minute briefings in 1 week, for example. That's a big commitment from them. That's doing it right. Get your top team to really think about, understand the science. And then from that, they'll be able to do it right. That's the way to do it. So, and just to a comment, and then I'll hand back to Khalil, and for some closing comments as well. But just, the comment about coherence and kind of coming back to things and weaving. We're seeing more and more that the power of our work in particular is giving people these tools that are kind of disruptive language you use many times, many different ways. SCARF is one, I showed that before. That's relevant to speaking up, to allyship, to inclusion, to many, many things. SEEDS is the other one, which is for mitigating bias, which is also relevant to all those spaces. And I think we're seeing increasing partnerships like we have with you, where a firm basically has access to all of it, and uses it in really creative ways. So it becomes a language that lives underneath, all of the good people work you're doing. And dare I say it, speaking to Microsoft, it becomes kind of an operating system for doing real science-based leadership development. That's kind of how it ends up looking. Can you speak to that at all? Is that anything you want to say there?
No, I love the idea that it's an operating system. That's how it feels, right? Yeah. That for us, the commitment to diversity and inclusion, but this journey that we're on from an allyship standpoint is about embedding it in everything that we do, so that we hold ourselves accountable for the fact that it requires ongoing effort. Some people say to me, like, Lindsay-Rae, would you say that you're an ally? And I say that isn't a title that I get to give myself, right? It is an aspiration that I have every day. And so I wake up every day wanting to learn more and do better.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. Khalil, you got some closing comments?
I mean, I don't like going after Lindsay-Rae ever. I've had to do it a couple different times and it never turns out well. Just honestly, David and Esther, obviously huge thank you for all of your contribution, both to the work and to this time together. And then Lindsay-Rae, I mean, honestly, we could just look through the chat and see all of the insights that people have had and all of the questions and the comments and, the modeling that you have demonstrated right now. And so thank you so much for graciously affording us a bit of your time and, the wisdom that you all have kind of accumulated over a period of time. And I know you'd be the first one to say you all don't have it nailed. It's not completely done. You're continuing to grow and iterate and evolve. And that's part of what we love about you all and your growth mindset and you specifically. So thank you for continuing to be an incredible partner and for sharing everything that you all have been doing with this group. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
It is my pleasure, and I'm really grateful for your partnership.
Well, in that case, we're going to keep calling.
Thank you.
Gabe, I'll turn it over to you for some closing comments. And folks, stick with us. We've got a couple things we want to make sure that we get you some information about. And many of you have asked questions around things like seeds and other things. So we continue to have webinars. We want to make sure that you know about some of that as well. So stick with us. We'll have you out before the top of the hour. Gabe,
thanks very much, Lindsay-Rae. Really appreciate you being here. Feel free to jump off if you want to do a couple of announcements, but thank you. And folks, we have a Wednesday at noon session every week. We've now scheduled every Wednesday at noon a session. I think next week is on Include, and it's going to be a demo of the real work. So if you're really kind of wanting to see the models and see the products and see that, every Wednesday at noon, we're going to be doing that. But I wanted to make a couple of announcements, and then Gabe's going to put up in about 30 seconds a poll as well in terms of how we can support you best. But this is a really important announcement. In fact, we're calling this Build a Better Normal. Our summit this year is called Build a Better Normal. We've decided in the last couple of weeks. I'm going to encourage you to hold the date. It's a 3-day around the clock, literally 72-hour global event to make organizations better for humans, to build a better normal. So if you have colleagues in APAC and EMEA, they're going to be able to join in their times because we have such a global following. So 10th to the 12th of November, it's normally $2,000 or $3,000 to attend the summit, plus accommodation and everything else. It's going to be under $500 to attend the summit for the full 72 hours, as much as you can this year. So hold the date. You're going to see an announcement coming up about that. A couple of other quick announcements. I think this is an important one. If you're struggling with the transition to virtual learning, like it's probably going to be here to stay for quite some time, reach out to us. We're doing a free learning strategy audit to organizations. You can select that in the poll in a minute. And that's where we take you through the science of actually transitioning to a virtual learning world, which, by the way, can actually be much better than workshops in terms of habits, much, much better rather than worse. We also have the NLI challenge where you can literally reduce the costs of all of learning by 25% and make it better. So reach out if you're interested in that. And I noticed a bunch of people ask questions. We're going to try and stay online for another 5 minutes. So we'll leave the line open and our team will try and answer some of your questions. There are a few specific questions in the chat and in the Q&A. We will stay on and try to answer those. If you're from an organization, we have insider exchanges every week. Esther's running them, Khalil's running them, Barbara, myself. Every week we have different insider exchanges, small groups of senior talent executives. Reach out to us if that's something you're interested in, if you've not been coming along. It's where we dig into specific topics. You'll find those super helpful peer networking groups. I think those are the big announcements. Just keep us in mind for your own education. Got some fantastic programs in terms of understanding the brain and building your skills. We'll leave the poll up for a few minutes. Feel free to pick one of these. One of our team will follow up and support you. But a big thanks to Lindsay-Rae, of course, big thanks to Khalil and Esther. It's a big topic. It's an emotive topic. We think it's even more important to follow the science when something is as important and as emotional as this. It's really important to do the right things and not just do something that feels right. Really important to be doing the right things in this space. Feel free to reach out to us if we can help you think about this in any way. Thanks very much, everyone. Over to you, Gabe.
Thanks, David. And Lindsay-Rae, of course, and Khalil and Esther and the team in the background that makes us all really work seamlessly. I hope everyone found some insights and value from today's conversation with our guests. And thanks to all of you for joining us on Zoom and on LinkedIn Live. We love hearing from you. The conversation has been amazing to see in the background. We'd also love to hear your feedback. So if you'd be willing, we'd love to hear what you thought of today's webinar with a 1-minute survey. Again, really about 1 minute. Anna Vargas and Mary Grace should be sharing a link in the chat. A couple other quick reminders before we let you go. If you can't get enough of your Brain at Work Live, we're back here Fridays at noon every week. Next week, guests are TBD, but if you know you want to make it, there should be a link in the chat where you can register and you'll be notified and reminded. Also, as David has mentioned, seeds came up a lot. Our product Decide is what encapsulates that. We do product demos on Thursdays, also at noon. David mentioned Wednesdays. These are in addition to that, so lots of opportunities to be able to connect with us on that. So next Thursday, we'll be looking at Decide. That's the neuroscience of breaking bias that mentions that seeds framework that David was referring to. So we'll be addressing sort of what that looks like in an organization. That's next Thursday at noon. That's the 23rd. The following Thursday on the 30th, we'll be talking about speaking up. So that will be a demo of voice. A link should also be coming through there. And if you're worried about keeping up with all these links, don't. They'll be sort of combined and forwarded off to you in an email at the end of the day that will also have a recording of today's session. Lastly, if you'd like to hear these Friday webinars on demand, they become podcast episodes, Your Brain at Work. So if you'd like to subscribe to that podcast on the platform of your choice, there should also be a link coming through. And that should be it for links and opportunities. I know that's a lot. We appreciate you sticking with us for the hour. This otherwise concludes our formal presentation for the day. As David mentioned, we'll leave the line open for another couple minutes in case there are any additional conversations going on. You can wrap those and exchange information if you'd like. On behalf of the NLI team and our panelists today, we offer you solidarity and continued safety in these times. Have a great weekend, and we hope to see you next week. Bye, everybody.